It was February 1944, and a British infantry private named Thomas Atkins was lying in a shell scrape on a hillside above the Arakan coast of Burma, writing in a letter that he knew might take 6 weeks to reach his mother in Sheffield, and that he was not entirely certain he would survive long enough for her reply to find him. He had been in Burma for 11 months. He had arrived from India in the Burma Campaign, which lasted from 1941 to 1945, and which British soldiers called the Forgotten War, with a bitterness that the name accurately conveyed, was in several important respects the most difficult military operation that British forces conducted during the Second World War. It was difficult not primarily because of the Japanese enemy, though the Japanese forces in Burma were formidable opponents who fought with a tenacity and tactical skill that British soldiers documented repeatedly in their letters and diaries. It was difficult because of the terrain and the climate, which imposed on every military operation a burden of physical suffering and logistical complexity that had no equivalent in any other theater where British forces fought. The Burmese jungle was not simply difficult ground to fight across. It was an environment that killed men independently of any enemy action, through malaria and dysentery and typhus and scrub typhus and the specific infections that jungle wounds produced when they were not treated within hours, through heat exhaustion and
Private letters from Burma, preserved in the Imperial War Museum's Department of Documents and in the National Army Museum in Chelsea, reveal a consistent pattern of description that differs markedly from the letters British soldiers sent from other theaters. The letters from North Africa and Italy describe a landscape that is harsh but comprehensible, terrain that can be navigated by trucks and tanks, an enemy that can be seen and located and engaged with the weapons and tactics that British military training had developed. The Burma letters describe something else, an environment so alien to the experience of men raised in England that many of them spent considerable portions of their letters simply attempting to convey what the jungle looked and smelled and sounded like, as if the act of describing it might make it more manageable, might transform it from something that exceeded the available vocabulary into something that language could contain. Corporal Geoffrey Barker of the 14th Army wrote to his wife in October 1943 that he had been trying for 3 weeks to explain in a letter what the jungle was like and had concluded that it was not possible to do so, that the specific combination of heat and noise and darkness and smell that
The Japanese Army's tactics in Burma were specifically designed to exploit the jungle's characteristics in ways that imposed maximum psychological pressure on British and Commonwealth forces. The Japanese practice of infiltration, moving through the jungle in small groups to emerge behind British positions and establish roadblocks on supply routes, had produced in the First Burma Campaign of 1942 a pattern of British retreat and eventual rout that the official history attributed primarily to superior Japanese tactics and the specific vulnerability of British supply lines to disruption. What the soldiers' letters from 1942 add to this official picture is a psychological dimension that the official history does not fully capture. The British forces who retreated from Rangoon to India in 1942 were not only defeated militarily, they were psychologically broken by a specific experience, the experience of fighting an enemy who appeared to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, who could be heard but not seen, who cut supply routes that the British commanders believed were secure, and who appeared behind positions that the soldiers defending them had believed to be safe. The letters from the survivors of the 1942 retreat describe a fear that differed qualitatively from the fear of artillery fire or tank attack, a fear produced by the specific impossibility of locating the threat, of knowing where the danger was coming from and when it would arrive. The letters from soldiers who had gone through this training and who then fought in the battles of 1944, the Arakan battles, and the epic defense of Kohima and Imphal document the difference that Slim's transformation of the 14th Army had produced. The letters from 1944 are not free of fear or suffering. They document both at considerable length, but they document them in a different register from the letters of 1942, a register that reflects men who have been given the tools to function in the environment and who are functioning in it, however painfully,
rather than men overwhelmed by an environment that exceeded their ability to understand or respond to it. Sergeant Harold Fletcher, who fought at Kohima in April and May 1944, wrote to his sister that the fighting in Kohima was the worst he had experienced in physical terms, that the Japanese defenders of the positions they were attacking fought with a ferocity that he had not previously encountered, and that the ground on which the fighting took place, the tennis court of the deputy commissioner's bungalow and the surrounding hillside, was so small and so intensely contested that the battle at Kohima in the spring of 1944 and the simultaneous siege of Imphal represented the turning point of the Burma campaign in a way that the soldiers who fought there understood with unusual clarity, because the battles were decided not by a single dramatic engagement, but by the accumulation of small unit actions over weeks and months, in which the specific qualities of individual soldiers and their immediate commanders were the determining factor to a degree that was unusual, even in infantry warfare. The Japanese 15th Army, under General Renya Mutaguchi, had launched Operation Yugo in March 1944 with the intention of capturing the supply base at Imphal and the communications center at Kohima, cutting the supply line to the 14th Army and forcing a British withdrawal from Assam that would open the road to India. The operation represented an enormous logistical gamble, sending Japanese forces across the Chindit River without adequate supply lines, in the expectation that the operation would be completed quickly and that British supplies captured at Imphal would sustain the attacking force. The gamble failed, partly because the British forces at Kohima and Imphal held longer than Mutaguchi's planning had anticipated, and partly because the supply situation for the Japanese forces deteriorated with a speed and completeness that turned the Japanese offensive into a catastrophic defeat, from which the Japanese army in Burma never fully recovered.
The soldiers who fought at Kohima described the battle in letters and diaries that are among the most vivid accounts of close-quarters combat in any British archive of the Second World War. The fighting on the tennis court, which became the symbolic center of the battle, involved positions so close that communication between the opposing forces was sometimes possible without any amplification, and soldiers on both sides could hear the conversations of their enemies. Private Ronald Humphreys wrote to his parents that he had spent 4 days in a position from which he could hear Japanese soldiers talking in the position opposite him, and that this had given the fighting a quality of personal intensity that larger-scale engagements did not have. That he was not fighting an abstraction or a military formation, but specific men whose voices he could hear and whose routines he had learned to recognize over 4 days of watching and listening from a few dozen meters away. He wrote that this was more disturbing than he had expected, not because it made him unwilling to fight, but because it made the fighting feel different from the way he had been told war felt, more like something happening between specific people, and less like the collision of forces that the language of official military communication suggested.
The question of disease, which shaped every aspect of the Burma campaign, from logistics to morale to the physical condition of every soldier who served there, appears in the letters with a frequency and a specificity that reflects its actual centrality to the soldier's experience. Malaria was the dominant fact of life in Burma for British soldiers to a degree that no other factor came close to matching. Not the Japanese, not the terrain, not the supply difficulties, but the simple biological reality that the Burmese jungle was full of the mosquitoes that carried the parasite, and that the measures available to prevent infection in 1943 and 1944 were incompletely effective and required a discipline in their application that was difficult to maintain under combat conditions.
The soldiers who came home from Burma came home to a country that had largely forgotten they had been there, which was the literal meaning of the Forgotten War and not merely a metaphor. The European War had ended in May 1945, with celebrations of a scale and completeness that had consumed the full attention of the British public and the British press, and the Burma campaign's conclusion in August 1945 received coverage that was not proportionate to the scale of what had been achieved there. A campaign that had involved over 1 million soldiers from Britain, India, Africa, and the United States, that had produced one of the largest land defeats inflicted on the Japanese army in the entire Pacific War,
and that had been fought in conditions of physical hardship that the European theater had not approached. The soldiers returned to these facts and to the gradual realization that the people at home did not fully understand what Burma had been, and the bitterness this produced, which was not primarily about recognition, but about the gap between experience and understanding, appears in the letters and diaries of men who had spent years in the jungle and who found that the vocabulary available to them at home was not adequate to what they needed to say. Thomas Atkins wrote to a friend from Burma in 1946 that he had tried